Welcome back. In our last session, we looked at the interlude in the Tabernacles narrative, the story of the woman taken in adultery. Then we moved to the first part of the section known as the aftermath of Tabernacles, looking at the cure of the man born blind. This narrative we saw has been divided into 7 segments or scenes. In our last session, we looked at the first 4. Jesus and the disciples' discussion of sin and sickness regarding the blind man, the actual miracle where the blind man comes to sight, the discussion that ensued between the neighbors and the now seeing man, and finally the first encounter between the cured man and the authorities, the Pharisees. In our current session, we continue our look at the narrative of the cure of the man born blind, picking up the narrative with the 5th scene, where the parents of the cured man are called in before the authorities. Then we shall move to the 6th scene, which is the second interrogation of the cured man by the religious authorities. And the 7th and final scene brings the narrative full circle, where Jesus once again encounters the cured man. And finally, there is a conclusion to the narrative, applying the theme of light and darkness, blindness and sight to the Pharisees. The name used to refer to the inquisitors now changes from Pharisees to the more generic the Jews. Correspondingly, the focus changes from the man who has been healed to his parents. This belays the thought of the authorities that a healing might not really have taken place. They call the parents for interrogation to get the facts straight. The narrator informs the reader of their intention at the very onset of the scene. The Jews did not believe 2 things: that the man was born blind and that he now sees again. In other words, whether or not a miracle had taken place. Note that the name for the authorities has changed from Pharisees to Jews. This might indicate a different source being utilized here. So they summon whom they think are the only ones that can verify their questions: the parents of the man born blind. And yet another interrogation begins. Is this one your son, whom you say was born blind? Is their first question. To which the parents readily answer, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. There is no question about his prior state to his encounter with Jesus. This leads to a further question for the parents. How then does he now see? Here, the parents, who are totally unaware of how their son gained his sight, answer honestly. How he sees now, we do not know. Note that the we do not know of the second question parallels the we know of the first question from the Jews. And they add for emphasis, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. The duplication of answer serves to emphasize that they have no idea of what has happened to their son. And so, invoking a principle of Jewish law, they say, ask him. He's of age. That is, he's reached his 13th birthday. And so, he can speak concerning himself. Arnold notes that this answer of the parents may indicate that the man is old enough to reason and answer the Pharisees' questions for himself. Now follows a very interesting comment of the editor, giving reasons why the parents answered so. He says, his parents said these things because they feared the Jews. Thus the motive not to answer all of the Jews' questions seems to be more than the fact that they did not have the necessary information at hand. The editor continues, that the Jews had already agreed. Note the pluperfect of the verb implies an effect of a decision made at some point in the past. What had they agreed on? That if someone should confess him, that is Jesus, to be the Christ, he would become aposynagogos, that is, expelled from the synagogue. Now, we spoke of the circumstances that lie behind this fear in the opening session of this series. From the work of Raymond Brown and J. Lewis Martin in particular, and a number of others following their lead, this reference to becoming aposynagogos might be anachronistic. Rather than referring to the time of Jesus and the blind man, it may refer to the time of the writing of the gospel, where Christian Jews were being made aposynagogos through the rewriting of the Birkat Hamanim after the fall of Jerusalem. Thus, the parents may be expressing a very real fear on the part of many who hear and read John's gospel. As a result, the parents said, "He is of age, ask him." In other words, they don't want any sanctions levied on them because of their son. Let him be sanctioned, but leave them out of it. Now, before we leave this scene with the parents, let's take a closer look at that unusual word aposynagogos. It appears 3 times in the text of the Gospel of John. Here, in 1242 and in 16:2. In each of these instances, scholars have seen it to be used anachronistically. It's composed of 2 Greek words, apo, meaning from or out of, a preposition, and synagoge, meaning the synagogue. So putting the 2 words together, we get aposynagogos means to put out of the synagogue. And as I said above, it most likely refers to the actions of the Pharisees after the fall of Jerusalem, expelling the supposed Christians from the synagogue through the use of the Birkat Hamanim. Not having gained what they wanted from the interrogation of the parents, the Pharisees, or the Jews, recall now the man that had been blind for interrogation, a second interrogation. This scene is pivotal as it shows the development of the spiritual insight that's taking place in the man due to his encounter with Jesus. The scene begins with a simple connective, therefore, the Greek un, implying that as a result of the previous, they still need more information. So they called the man who was blind a second time. They begin in a much more solemn juridical manner than in the previous investigation. The imperative, give glory to God, is a solemn exhortation to tell the truth, similar to our do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Kostenberger adds the nuance that it also implies that the person who is so exhorted has done wrong. Yet Brown suggests it may also be a play on words, allowing the man who now sees to give glory to God for his sight. Then they begin their case. We know, they're sounding like the parents here, that this man, Jesus, is a sinner. The healed man quickly responds, if he is a sinner, that is, if your presuppositions are true, I do not know. But there is one thing I do know. Being blind, I now see. That's the blind man's way of giving glory to God. In line with Brown, Orchard notes that what we have here is developing into a fine duel between hypocrisy and simple truth. Note, as the interrogation continues, The native humor of the brave respondent gives his answers a caustic turn. Given the opportunity by the healed man's mention of being able to see, the inquisitor seized the opportunity once more to ask him yet again, "What did he do to you?" This sets up the third retelling of the story by the healed man. Once to the neighbors, once to the Pharisees, and now a second time to the Jews and the Pharisees. So the healed man responds to the inquisitors with rapid-fire, heartfelt responses, explaining what he experienced rather than who brought it about. Their demand to retell the story may be to be sure that he does not contradict anything that he said in the first account, which then would question his credulity. He will not be taken in by their tricks, however. "I told you already," he begins, "and you did not listen or hear. Why do you wish to hear it again?" But then he rises to the heights of irony, as Beasley Murray puts it, when he implies that they may want to learn more in order to become Jesus' disciples. The reality is quite the opposite. That answer serves only to infuriate the authorities even more. They continued heaping abuse on the man, which was a common way of dealing with people of lower status. It conveyed, according to Arnold, the notion that they were unworthy of receiving a direct answer. They said, "You are a disciple of that one." However, noted by the particle de, we are disciples of Moses. The more passionate the cured man becomes about Jesus as a man of God, the harder the Jews push, finally drawing him into an argument of guilt by association. They have failed all through this gospel, especially in this unit, to see who Jesus is. That is, that he comes from God, that he has a revelation from God, and that he speaks with authority given by God. The reason is basically that Jesus does not fit into their understanding of what a messenger or prophet from God should be. Hence, they're blind to him. But the man is beginning to get it, and he's beginning to see. They continue, "We know that God has spoken to Moses. It's generally accepted that God spoke to and through Moses in the establishment of the Mosaic covenant. Now the same cannot be said about Jesus. In fact, regarding him, they say, we don't even know where he comes from. For the authorities, Moses is a proven quantity. They can trace their tradition back to Moses. Jesus, however, is for them an unproven upstart, who, as we have seen from this gospel, can trace his authority, however, well beyond Moses to the throne of God himself. But these men refuse to see anything of that sort. To their lesson in authenticity and authority, the cured man answers, "For in this, the remarkable thing is that you don't know where he is or where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes." The readers and hearers at this point begin to cheer on the cured man. The cured man continues adopting the royal we of the Sanhedrin. "We know," he says, "that God does not listen to sinners." On this, both the authorities and the cured man can be in agreement. He continues, "But if someone should be God-fearing and might do his, that is God's will, this one God hears." This parallels the rabbinic teaching found in the Exodus Rabbah 21:3. It says, the man who does not do the will of God, or the man who does do the will of God and prays in complete faith, is heard both in this world and in the world to come. Thus, the first principle of his argument is established. Now comes the second principle. Note, this man is not a typical lower-class blind beggar. He knows his theology, and he can argue it with the best of them. From eternity, he continues, it has not been heard that someone has opened the eyes of one who was blind. Arnold corroborates the man's statements in saying instances of blind persons being healed in Jewish tradition are extremely rare. For instance, Tobiah in the book of Tobit 11:10-14. But the healing of a man born blind is without parallel. Now comes the conclusion that the man draws from these two principles. Unless this one, that is Jesus, were from God, he would be able to do nothing. Not a bad argument for a cured blind man. The opponents, the authorities, cannot argue with the logic of the argument. Hence, all they can do is attack the one who presented it. So comes the response. In total sin you were born? Unknowingly, they admit that he was born blind. The blindness would be the result of previous sin in the family. If that's the case, and they must admit that he now sees, then Jesus more than likely did open his eyes. They continue. And you teach us? How dare you? Who do you think you are? Failing totally to hear what the cured man said, only incensed at the fact that he was courageous enough to say it, they threw him out. They threw him out of the Sanhedrin chamber. Through the cured man, Jesus the light was offering the Sanhedrin a chance to be enlightened, but they chose to remain in darkness. We have already heard about that in the Nicodemus episode in John 3:19-21. This may lead the leaders to recall the expulsion from the synagogue that caused the formation of the Johannine community in the first place. We come now to the seventh scene of the blind man narrative, in which Jesus, having heard the fate of the cured man, seeks him out. Notice again the use of the verb find from chapter 1. In this final scene, the man makes the final step of faith. The scene switches to Jesus, who is seemingly in the temple precincts. Word got to Jesus that they, the Pharisees or the Jews, had cast the man who was cured out. And so Jesus seeks him, and finding him, asks a simple yet crucial question. Do you believe in the Son of Man? The way the question is phrased expects the answer yes, and offers the man the possibility of making a significant act of faith. The man answers Jesus as quickly as he did the Pharisees, but with quite a bit less acerbity, addressing Jesus by the polite title Sir or Kuria. As we shall see as this final scene develops, the man will come to see Jesus as much more than a simple gentleman to be addressed by Sir. Rather, he will see Jesus as Kurios, that is Lord or God. That development begins with the man questioning who this Son of Man is. His purpose, that he might believe in him. Jesus' response is clear. Not only have you seen him, in fact, the one speaking with you now, that one is he. A response very similar to the one given to the Samaritan woman in chapter 4. The man responds, I believe, Lord, there's that Kuria again, and worships him. The combination of believe and worship show that this man has come to a much deeper understanding of who Jesus is. He sees him as divine, and so the term Kuria takes on a much deeper connotation than mere sir. It's an acknowledgement of Jesus as Lord and God. So in this, the man does the very thing that he was commanded to do by the Pharisees. He gives glory to God. And in that, he advances from the realm of Judaism to the realm of Christianity. Von Walde notes of the prostration, because this is an expression of belief in the divinity of Jesus, the meaning intended is surely Lord in the religious sense. The whole scene is brought to a conclusion with a final comment from Jesus, which links the entire chapter to the light-darkness theme of the Gospel of John. It makes the event a symbol of the grace and judgment which Jesus brings into the world. The statement begins, "For judgment I have come into the world." This is a direct reference to the end of the Nicodemus episode in chapter 3, which talks about light and darkness and the moral value attached to each, John 3:19-21. Then he moves to an explanation, or moves on to explain the purpose of his coming in light of what has just transpired with the blind man and the Jews. He came to those who did not see that they might see. That refers to the man who was cured. At the beginning, he could not see, and now he sees through the action of Jesus. He has come from darkness into light. And further, he has come that those who can see might become blind. This refers to the Pharisees or the Jews, who have chosen to live in darkness and not be enlightened by the light of Christ. They, despite all their knowledge, cannot come to an understanding of who Jesus is. What's significant here is that the man born blind was not merely cured of his physical blindness, but he was also led to an insight into which the man who cured him was. He was cured also of a spiritual blindness. The Pharisees hear what Jesus has just said, and they question him. John puts it strangely. The ones being with him, hoi met autou ontes, that is, the ones from the Pharisees. Kostenberger implies that although this conversation was meant to be private, it must have been held in a public place, since the Pharisees were able to overhear it. The ensuing question of the Pharisees serves to transform what has just happened from a mere miracle narrative to a moral parable about blindness and sight in the spiritual realm. The Pharisees ask, Me kai hemes tufloi esmen. Yes, I know that's Greek. Surely even we are not among the blind. I cite it in Greek because two small points are very significant. First, the particle me, with which the question begins, indicates the incredulity of the Pharisees about the fact that they could be blind. The particle implies that the answer to the question is no. The second is the next two words, kai hemes, translated even we, furthers their unwillingness to think of themselves as blind. Jesus' response is clear. If indeed you were blind, which clearly you aren't, you would have no sin. However, that is, on the other hand, expressed by the particle de, now that you say we see, your sin remains. Maloney sums the entire movement up well. as the commentary on the story of the journey to sight of the man born blind and the Jews' journey into blindness. Jesus describes the judgment that he brings as the blind come to sight, and those seeing move towards blindness. The man's insistence that he did not know, and his search for the Son of Man that he might believe, contrasts with the Jews' arrogant affirmations of their knowledge, which leads to their decision that Jesus is a sinner, a person whose origins are not known. Well, that's all the time we have for in this session. Next time, we'll look at one of the classic texts of John's Gospel, the parable of the Good Shepherd, and see how it forms the basis of the picture of Jesus in the Passion narrative. See you then.